Hi. So, first of all, welcome to YouTube. I'm trying to make eye contact, but I don't really know how that's going to work. So, apologies in advance. At least it'll be short. So, today's lecture really is just an introduction to epic. What do we mean when we talk about epic poetry? What are some of the themes you can expect looking at ancient epic poetry? And what are the kinds of questions that are going to be productive when we examine some epic texts over the next week or so, all right? So epic is one of those genres that more people know about than have read. Everyone knows what a comedy is. Everyone's read a comedy. Everyone's seen a comedy. There aren't that many epic poems, but we all tend to have a certain set of connections in our minds when we see epic, right? One of them, and this is something that is really worth taking seriously, it's long. Epic is a long genre. We're not going to be reading any epics front to back in this class, although I'm more than happy to recommend. It's one of my favorite genres of ancient writing. I'm obsessed with them. They're fun as hell. And we're just going to be looking at highlights. I really encourage you to go further with the genre. There's a ton there, and it's something that we have real specialists on running all around the classics department here at Colorado. But what we're going to be engaging with in this class are selections from the Aeneid, probably the most famous epic in Latin, and a sort of parody of the Aeneid written by Lucan called the Pharsalia. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more later on. So what makes these texts epic? One, obviously, long as hell. Another, which we're going to have a hard time actually talking about explicitly in class, but which you should be very conscious of, is that epic follows really strict metrical rules. Now, for those of you who don't know what a metrical rule is, or what meter is, it's like the rhythm of poetry, right? So, to take a line from Shakespeare, oh, hark, what light through yonder window breaks. That's Romeo and Juliet, right? That line actually follows an extremely strict meter. We call it iambic pentameter. And iamb is a ba-bum, right? Oh, hark, what light through yonder window breaks. Good Shakespeare reads better than that, but you get the idea, right? So, epic in Latin and in Greek, and we'll talk about why that is in a bit, follows dactylic hexameter. For those of you who haven't seen it, the dactyl as a foot sounds like ba ba ba. So a dactylic hexameter will usually go something like ba 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 ba. And we can talk about that in more detail when we do the Aeneid. If you have any questions about it, come to office hours. All you need to know is that epic has a very, very clean meter, a fairly strict meter that is understood as a simple requirement of the genre. It's like how poetry is supposed to rhyme in English according to your second grade teacher or whatever. That's what epic is. If it is not in dactylic hexameter, it is not epic. Now, importantly, dactylic... Okay, I did my hair the wrong way. Wait, is it left or... Okay, we're good. Now, dactylic hexameter is originally a Greek form. Epic is originally an incredibly Greek form. We talked a little about this in the comic context, where we're building off of Greek comic models, specifically Aristophanes and Menander. The model for epic in the Greek world is someone we've probably heard of, Homer, right? Homer is the author of the two most famous epic poems of all time, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those are about the Trojan War and its aftermath, right? I'm just going to loom over the camera for a second to try to recreate that sense of kinetic motion. Okay, so these deal with the Trojan War, which some of you might have heard of. It's a sort of major founding event of Greek civic mythology or whatever. That theme is really going to carry forward in a direct way and a more thematic way. In a thematic sense, epic as a genre is very, very worried with what we would now call questions of national memory or of a kind of ethnic history, how this people came to be, right? You're going to see a ton of that in the Aeneid. In a more direct sense, most Latin epic follows Greek in dealing with the Trojan War. In particular, a comparatively minor character in the Iliad is a prince of Troy named Aeneas, who flees the wreck of Troy when Troy is set on fire by the Greeks at the end of the war. There's like a horse and stuff. He sails around for a while, ends up landing in Italy and founding the Italic settlement that will eventually become Rome. This is an older tradition in Roman national myth, but Virgil really writes the story about it. So that's what we can expect there. However, Virgil is not the first Latin epic poet. The founder of Latin epic is a guy I mentioned earlier, sort of the first Latin author, Ennius. Ennius's dates, He's born 239 BCE, dies 179 BCE, and is really our first surviving author. I'm mentioning him for a few reasons. First of all, just as an advertisement, this campus is host to one of the world's foremost experts on Ennius, Professor Jackie Elliott. I'm not sure why I'm saying one of. The world's foremost expert in Ennius is at CU Boulder. Her name is Jackie Elliott. She's fabulous. If you ever get a chance to take a class with her, she often teaches Greek tragedy. Take it, okay? So Ennius makes a number of decisions, and we should understand them as conscious decisions. Did it again. That are going to just set the rules for what Latin epic looks like ever after. One of those rules is that he follows Greek meter. Ennius chooses to write his epic in dactylic hexameter. Another is to very explicitly follow the Homeric model. Ennius's Annales, which is an annalistic history, it goes year by year, actually begins with Homer, the Greek epic poet that we were just talking about, visiting Ennius in a dream to show that Ennius is the heir to this particular and particularly Greek epic tradition. Now, there is one really important difference, though, between how Roman epic works and how Greek epic works. The Trojan War is mythological, right? There are like gods running around, people like get dipped in the river Styx and are immortal. If you saw Troy, you get the idea. This is not all like eminently realistic. But Ennius is writing, we think, Ennius doesn't fully survive, about some much more prosaic events. He starts with the escape of Aeneas and the founding of Troy, but he goes on to the politics of the 2nd century BCE. He describes the reign of Cato the Censor, a political figure of the time. Roman epic, Latin epic, thinks about Roman politics, or Rome's own kind of current history, as a fair subject for epic. Virgil doesn't quite do this. While Virgil's commenting on current events, his story is entirely in a mythic past. But this is going to be important when we get to figures like Lucan. There is a way to talk about Roman history and epic that doesn't quite exist in the Greek model. It's one of the earliest places where you see Latin literature innovating on its Greek model. And while that's not something we can talk about a ton, just because I can't assume all of you have read the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's something really interesting. And for those of you who have read the Iliad and the Odyssey, that could be a really cool paper topic. There's a lot there. Okay? So, this will come as no great shocks to you, love this political side of epic. Love the way that epic engages with the community from which it's produced in these two very different ways. On one hand, it will just talk about that community very directly, but on the other, epic's grandeur. We call things epic for a reason, right? Epic's that thing makes it incredibly well suited for telling stories about a people, for these national myths. A national mythography, the creation of these kinds of national stories. The creation of these kinds of national stories is an incredibly political process. There's a real way of reading epic, Virgil probably being the clearest example, that is unbelievably cynical. And it's not obviously wrong all the time. It just takes these texts as propaganda. And as we're going to see, Virgil's Aeneid is sponsored by Augustus. Virgil is sort of one of the court poets of the Augustan period. He's a friend of the state, at least explicitly. But personally, I don't think of the Aeneid, I don't think of any of these texts as simply propagandistic. Virgil is doing the most. Virgil is also establishing a meaningful artistic vantage point that, while friendly to the state, is meaningfully outside of it, and in some ways quite critical of it. Virgil's Aeneas, the mythical ancestor of the emperor, this national hero, is not perfect. He makes some mistakes. He's not entirely sympathetic. And that isn't because Virgil thought that the state would like him better if he drew him that way. Virgil is an artistic figure. That's a weird phrase. Virgil's an artist. He's a literary author who is telling a literary story, which means that his characters are trying to do a little bit more than just being flat stock figures in a national pageant, right? That's why I really like the Aeneid. There's an obvious political story happening here, but it's happening within a piece of art that functions as art in its own rights that a person can find very beautiful. So we're going to read the Book 4 of the Aeneid and Book 12 of the Aeneid in this class. I want to talk first, though, about Book 4, because that's the one that we're going to be reading for next week, that we're going to be talking about on Monday, all right? So Aeneas, going into Book 4, has already fled Troy. He leaves the burning ruins and ends up in Carthage. Now, for those of you who have heard of Carthage, Carthage is sort of Rome's ancestral enemy. At this point, they're pretty much gone. Carthage has been destroyed. The fields were sowed with salt, all that jazz. But in pretty recent memory, sort of less than a century ago, Carthage was actively trying to wipe Rome off the map. It was Rome's greatest rival in the Mediterranean. So setting a scene in Carthage, as Book 4 is incredibly loaded, especially given the particular dynamics of what unfolds in Carthage. Aeneas shows up there. Sorry about that. Aeneas shows up there, and in order to keep him safe, his mother, the love goddess Venus, or the Roman form of Aphrodite, enchants the queen of Carthage, a woman named Dido, to fall in love with him so she won't kill him on sight, as she might otherwise do. Dido wants him to stay and found Carthage with her, but that doesn't happen, and things get weird, right? There's a lot going on in Book 4. Dido is one of the sort of most immortal characters coming out of the Aeneid, and in some ways is a Virgilian creation. While the story of Dido certainly predates Virgil, he does a lot with that character. He makes her extraordinarily sympathetic and really works to flesh her out in ways that, again, a strictly propagandistic narrative demonstrating the weakness or evil of the hated Carthaginians just wouldn't. Virgil is taking real artistic risks in the character of Dido in Book 4, and you should be paying some attention to what he's doing, because it's, leaving aside the fact that I think it's gorgeous, it's a very interesting index to what a person could get away with, even in an overtly nationalistic text like the Aeneid. Okay? There's one other weird quirk of your assignment for Monday, though, that I want to talk about before I let you go. All right? You're technically going to be reading Book 4 twice. I've assigned 2 translations. The first is in your book by Frederick Ahl, and the second is on Canvas. It's a translation by Shadi Bart Zimmer at the University of Chicago. Now, Shadi is great. Just full disclosure, she was my undergraduate advisor. She's the most impossibly glamorous person I've ever met, and I've never seen her wear the same thing twice. Please keep that in mind when you're deciding on the merit of her work. However, I also think it's important to understand how different two translations of the same text may be. This is actually something that I find a little bit frustrating about your book, and I want to make it very explicit. Take your book out. You can pause here and go to page 632. You're going to see a list of contributors there, right? That's the translators. They're the people who actually wrote the texts that are in your book. You want to keep track of that. Not so much because some of them are better than others or anything like that, but these are really the people who are producing what you're reading. And I think as a fairness issue, it's important to be aware of their work, right? But with the Aeneid in particular, Frederick Ahl and Shadi Barch are engaging in two unbelievably different projects. They're writing in different registers for different reasons and making the text look very, very different. I find it a meaningfully different experience reading these two authors, and I want you to think about how different two different translations can be. Now, in this case, this is largely about artistic things. Shadi strikes me as a much more direct writer, and you can decide how you like or don't like that. They're each making very aggressive or artistic choices about how to present the Aeneid as a text. There are some other places, though, where translation is a somewhat more loaded endeavor. So something we talked about in class on Wednesday was the appearance of the word fag in Menachmi. And I just looked this up because I thought that would be an interesting way to get into the problem of translation. The term appears in line 513, which is on page 28 of your book, about how you'd think that all men are fags because they wear dresses. That was jarring to me because, as some of you may know, and as we'll talk about in my gender and sexuality class in the spring, which you should take, Roman men could have sex with men without being seen as sort of compromised or as sexually corrupted. That just wasn't the relevant axis of identity. The relevant axis of identity instead was what we might call role. Whether someone played the active or passive role in homosexual sex. There are more colloquial terms for it that I will leave be. If you're confused and this matters to you, come to office hours and I'll be a little bit more blunt, but we're on YouTube. So the term in Latin, as I suspected, is canidas, which refers to a man who plays a stereotypically feminine role in a homosexual relationship. It does not mean gay person in anything like our modern sense of the term. In translating that as fag, your translator is making a few very conscious decisions. The term canidas is extremely rude, and your translator wants to get that across, that it's a shocking term, that it's a swear, essentially. Also wants to get across this idea of effeminacy and a certain kind of scorn. But they're valuing that over really precisely delineating. Okay, you know what? Tissue break. I'm a very fancy man. Really precisely delineating the phenomenology of these terms. Technically speaking, fag refers to a different set of behaviors than does canidas, but the metaphor, how those behaviors are evaluated, kind of works the same way, and your translator is making a decision to do that. That said, your translator is also deciding to represent the text in a way that can be a little bit hostile to certain audiences. And that's something that will very often come up in translations. Are we translating in ways that respect the points of view of different kinds of potential readers, or that attempt to mimic the choices made by the author? I think there's a lot to be said for both approaches, and your text is really clearly picking the second. Which, again, I'm fine with, as long as we recognize this text is not for us, and this text might not be for good people. All right? So those are really the big issues that I want you to be conscious of dealing with the Aeneid. This is a heavily nationalistic text in a heavily nationalistic genre that is nevertheless complicating its story of Roman greatness by really encouraging us to sympathize, to empathize, to think along with, to feel for someone who is technically an obstacle in Aeneas' journey to the founding of Rome, right? So here are the discussion questions that I want you to have in mind for Monday's class. And remember, you have to write a response for one of the classes next week. It can be Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, but it has to be one of them. So here, and these don't have to be about the discussion questions, but if you find them helpful for organizing your thoughts, then go for it. The discussion questions are, how are these two translations, Frederick All's and Shadi Barthes-Zimmer's, different? Which one, how is the reading experience different between the two, and why do you think they're different? How heroic should we understand Aeneas' actions in Book 4 to be? What is heroism? What is heroism in Virgil? What is heroism to us? How are they different? And finally, what does this text have to tell us about Carthage and its neighbors, but especially Carthage? Carthage is a hated city in the Roman national imaginary, right? Just sort of how they think about the world. And I'm curious what you think appears of Carthage in the text of Aeneid Book 4. So that's all. As you're watching this, I am probably wandering around Edinburgh, Scotland, trying to buy some sort of chunky sweater. Wish me luck.